I don't know about you, but when I think of BioWare, almost everything falls into two pretty neat eras in my mind. There's the early computer stuff, Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, monstrously huge computer RPGs that won massive acclaim for replicating the world of Dungeons & Dragons to an almost perfect level. Then, later on, you've got the console stuff, Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect and Dragon Age, which is where I jumped on board. I'd always loved RPGs, but never had a PC I could game on, so when BioWare brought the experience into the living room, streamlined for controllers, pumped full of exciting narrative and engaging combat, I was absolutely hooked. I used to count down the minutes at school until I could get home and return to the world of Jedis and Wookiees, or trade theories with my friends about who was indoctrinated and who wasn't in the Mass Effect world. Sadly, the studio has fallen on slightly harder times recently, in no small part because of the massive commercial and critical failure of Anthem and Mass Effect Andromeda. Still, there aren't many other studios who can claim to have consistently made such an impact on the video game landscape. They're at the same time responsible for not only codifying what we would expect from the niche world of CRPGs, huge worlds to explore, hundreds of side quests, huge depth in character creation, but also defining what AAA console RPGs would look like, with gripping cinematic narratives and a hugely appealing mixture of customization and fast-paced action. It's totally reasonable to say that without Baldur's Gate, there's no Divinity or Disco Elysium, and without Dragon Age, there's no Dragon's Dogma or Witcher 3. It's hefty praise, but it got me thinking. Considering how huge the gulf between PC and console gaming was until only very recently, you'd be forgiven for being confused as to just how a studio renowned for making complicated, text-heavy mouse and keyboard games managed to transition into the controller-driven, fast-paced and flashy world of console development so seamlessly. Well, to answer that question, simply and bluntly, they didn't. Today we're going to look at the proverbial missing link in the BioWare back catalogue. A game that tells the story of a studio striking out and trying something new, but sadly ending up ultimately forgotten. An important but lost stepping stone in their transformation from niche developer to global mega studio. This is Jade Empire, and we're going to look at why it never got a sequel. While it seems obvious now that a studio creating hit after hit in the PC market would eventually want to take a piece of the much larger home console pie, the roots of BioWare's switch from former to latter actually start with a huge transition they underwent before Jade Empire was even in development. BioWare's original classic masterpieces were Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, which took the Dungeons & Dragons world created by Wizards of the Coast and successfully replicated it on PC monitors with keyboard and mice instead of pen and paper. I could talk for hours about just how good Baldur's Gate is, and I've already edited out more waffling praise than I care to admit, but for the purpose of this video, just take it from me that Baldur's Gate is an incredible mixture of depth, complexity, excitement, and replayability. They did such a fantastic job replicating the world and feel of Dungeons & Dragons that they attracted the eye of another media giant, who despite having multiple hit video games to its name already, wanted something that took influence from this sprawling role-playing phenomenon. In 2000, LucasArts contacted BioWare about giving them the much sought-after Star Wars license and letting them loose on the world of Jedis, bounty hunters and Wookiees. Obviously, BioWare jumped at the chance to create the first ever Star Wars RPG, with CEO Dr. Greg Zeschuk saying they were honoured to be working with the extremely talented folks at LucasArts, developing a role-playing game based on one of the most high-profile licenses in the world. For a studio that had exclusively worked in the niche world of Dungeons & Dragons, it was a chance to evolve from a big fish in a small pond to a real oceanic heavy hitter. LucasArts wanted many of the same things that BioWare had delivered for Dungeons & Dragons: a huge world to explore, a gripping and creative story to drive the game forwards, and fleshed out characters who players would be interested in. The difference, however, was that there are some inherent demands that working on a Star Wars game brings, which are very different to the slow-paced role-playing of Baldur's Gate. For starters, the game would naturally have to be shorter and simpler than the hundreds of hours of complex gameplay that Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 represented. It might seem odd to say in the age of Steam and Xbox Game Pass, but back in the 90s and 2000s, there was a sort of unwritten rule that PC games were generally more complicated and ambitious than their console counterparts. While console gamers enjoyed Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, PC gamers were sinking their teeth into Deus Ex, Planescape Torment, and Fallout, which meant BioWare had to aim for something slightly more accessible than they had previously made. A more streamlined experience was also necessary, as on top of the expected PC version, BioWare were also going to be developing for Microsoft's fledgling Xbox console, which had been released in 2001. Project lead Casey Hudson, when asked about the decisions in an interview in 2003, said they decided on the Xbox primarily because of its architecture being similar to that of a PC, meaning that they could work their in-house engine, the Aurora engine, without needing massive changes to how they developed. On top of this, the Xbox didn't have a major RPG out yet, so BioWare saw an opportunity to release a hugely anticipated game with a massively popular license onto a surprisingly successful new console. Finally, LucasArts and BioWare both agreed that the game needed to match the cinematic ambitions of the movies that the RPG would be based on. This meant taking the world building and depth of their previous games and combining it with fast-paced combat, stylish cutscenes, and a cinematic story, something which, according to Hudson, hadn't been done in the industry before. It was a premise that was not only exciting for the video game media, but also the development team at BioWare. As long as they hit these criteria, they were essentially given free rein to make whatever game they wanted. And Zizek says of the time, "We felt like we had the freedom to create something truly wonderful." Frankly, that excitement and passion shows in the game. Knights of the Old Republic, when it finally released in 2002, was an enormous success, garnering over 40 Game of the Year awards, and has gone on to be remembered as one of the best games of all time. All of the ambition that BioWare had is realised perfectly, and it's become one of the most revered parts of the Star Wars franchise. In fact, it remains the only non-film, pre-Disney story to be kept as part of the post-Disney canon, which just shows its relentless popularity, not only with RPG fans, but average Joe Star Wars fans and everyday gamers. But this is a video about Jade Empire, right? Not Knights of the Old Republic. While Knights of the Old Republic was the sort of success that most developers can only dream of, there was actually one element which prevented it from being a complete success in the minds of the BioWare leadership. It was someone else's property, and BioWare wanted to be known for making original worlds. It meant that, much to most people's surprise, their next game would not be a follow-up to their Star Wars role-playing super hit, but would instead be a completely new and completely original video game set in a world designed by BioWare themselves. Moving on from being that company that makes amazing games out of other people's ideas was the final step in BioWare's grand evolution, and Jade Empire was going to be the game that made it all possible. In an interview with computerandvideogames.com, senior producer on Jade Empire, Dermot Clark, talks about how the idea for Jade Empire had actually been knocking around at BioWare for over 10 years. It's one of those ideas that was there at the beginning of the company. We had to wait for the technology to get to the point where we could make it. The guys here are huge kung fu and Chinese action flick fans. We wanted to make an action-oriented adventure RPG with Chinese historical influences for a long time. While there's no written confirmation of this, I think it's pretty easy to imagine that the leadership at BioWare felt that they had earned enough credit with their fanbase, and RPG fans in general, to be able to position something totally new. While their previous games are all riding on the back of a famous license, it wasn't like their fans had jumped ship when they switched from Dungeons & Dragons to Star Wars, which realistically are quite different properties with different appeals. Clark continues in the interview. One of the things the designers were looking forward to the most was not having the restrictions of a license, just being able to do anything you want, and know that you're not contravening the rules or someone else's idea of how it should all go. It's very cool. On top of it being good timing for the studio itself, it also seemed like the ideal time to launch a video game influenced by martial arts and mythological China. In December 2000, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon had come out to unexpected critical and financial success, which led to an explosion of interest in Chinese action cinema. Martial arts movies had always had a niche appeal in the West, with the movies of Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan being seen as something for teenage nerds rather than something which could be nominated for 10 Academy Awards and sell millions of tickets worldwide. With its beautiful visuals, mystic story, and highly choreographed fight scenes, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon changed all of that and paved the way for films like House of the Flying Daggers, Hero, and Kung Fu Hustle to make huge impact outside of Eastern cinema. So we had a studio with a fantastic track record, finally able to put together their dream project and what seemed like a market primed for more dramatic RPG goodness. The idea was to take the bones of Knights of the Old Republic and mix them with real-time Kung Fu-influenced combat, all while building a completely new original setting that could stand toe-to-toe with the likes of Star Wars and Dungeons & Dragons. It was a dangerous tightrope to walk, but one that the BioWare development team were just as excited about as they had been during their last big gamble. Jade Empire eventually released in April 2005 and got pretty great reviews from the gaming media. An 8 out of 10 from Eurogamer, an 8 out of 10 from GameSpot, with David Clayman of IGN describing it as the best RPG of the year, if not the best game of the year, full stop. It's currently sitting at an 89 out of 100 on Metacritic, which, considering it was BioWare's second ever console game, ain't bad. Okay, it's not quite the 40 Game of the Year awards that Knights of the Old Republic got, but for something with zero brand appeal, it's pretty damn good going. The BioWare leadership were on cloud 9, dream project completed, now just to let the Benjamins and Acclaim roll in. Only, there was an ever so slight spanner in the works. It sold badly. Like, really, really badly. Here in the UK, it debuted at number 7 on the charts and had fallen out of the charts completely by the 3rd week of release. By the end of 2007, 2 years after release, Jade Empire had only sold a paltry 450,000 copies worldwide, which, when compared to Knights of the Old Republic, had sold 1.3 million copies in the US alone in the same time frame. It was an absolutely huge disappointment for BioWare. The series was quietly moved on from, and luckily for BioWare, their next game, Mass Effect, which was another attempt at a new IP, would go on to be their biggest game yet and propel BioWare back to the top of the video game industry. But why did this first attempt at a new IP, so lovingly put together by a passionate studio, fail so completely, despite getting fantastic reviews? As is sadly the way in the video game industry, often forces outside of the development studio can have a huge effect on a game's success. Without even discussing a second of gameplay, narrative, or art design, there are a few major factors we need to talk about that meant Jade Empire was struggling before it even hit the shelves. The largest of these, and the one that's actually been acknowledged by BioWare executives since, is that they really screwed up the launch pretty badly. Due to how successful the development of Knights of the Old Republic had been, and the increased pressure from having to develop a completely new setting, BioWare had committed to releasing Jade Empire on the original Xbox in order to simplify development. It makes sense. Your staff already have the skills, and you've already got most of the kit. Just make another game in broadly the same way. Easy, right? Well, there was a big unforeseen downside. By the time it was actually finished and ready to be shipped, Jade Empire ended up releasing deep in the graveyard shift of the Xbox's life in mid-2005, just as the much-hyped Xbox 360 was scheduled to release. It meant consumers were much less likely to spend money on something not only unfamiliar, but also old-looking, and were much more likely to save their money for the flashy next generation. Jade Empire wasn't actually the only new IP to suffer from this phenomenon. Within the same 2-month period in 2005, both Psychonauts and Advent Rising, both of which were completely new IPs that released to great reviews, sold really poorly. Dr. Greg Zishuk said this launch window mistake was his only regret from his time at the helm of the company. I think making Jade Empire a 360 launch title would have been massive. It reminds me of what's going on right now, with analysts saying that game sales are down because people are waiting for new consoles. And we released Jade Empire into that kind of window. In retrospect, it would have been great to put it off a bit and polish the game a bit more. In addition to launching in a really difficult window, Jade Empire was always facing an uphill battle when it came to convincing Xbox owners to dive in with its aesthetic and setting. When you look at the top 20 selling games on the Xbox original, despite how varied it is, there's actually a common theme connecting a lot of them. It was a system that really catered towards a more mature Western audience, with a lot of shooters, sports games, and military-inspired franchises. In fact, the only games in a more RPG or fantasy style were Fable and Morrowind, which, while they are both absolutely fantastic games, they benefited from absolutely massive marketing campaigns and online hype, which Jade Empire sadly didn't. The ad campaign that did the rounds on network TV was frankly awful. The spots are only 15 seconds long and barely really even show what the game is. It's just short, random clips from the game, along with a voiceover talking dramatically about the soul of the Jade Empire. It really shows that BioWare, without a huge publisher or licensing partner, just didn't have the cash to create the sort of industry buzz that Lionhead and Bethesda were able to do in partnership with Microsoft. It was a lot to ask of the average gamer in the early years of mass internet media. Remember, this was still in the age of brick and mortar shops, where it was really common to have no idea what a game was actually like until you bought it and put it into your system. The problem was that people saw Jade Empire on the shelves, didn't really know what it was, and therefore didn't buy it. Now this is pure and utter speculation, but I think there also maybe wasn't the audience that BioWare imagined for a game influenced by martial arts films and historical Chinese literature. While Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and House of the Flying Daggers had brought that aesthetic and style to the West in a big way, the world of cinema and video games were very different arenas in the early 2000s. For example, in his review of Crouching Tiger for The Guardian in 2000, Peter Bradshaw writes, "Ang Lee's achievement is to reconnect to the genre with its innate, latent sense of decorum and romance. Qualities that have historically been ignored or treated unintelligently." Essentially, these were movies that weren't just exciting kung fu epics, but they were seen as art that appealed to more traditional film buffs. If I can don my film fanatic hat for a second, let me illustrate this by showing you the famous chess courtyard fight between Jet Li and Donnie Yen from the film Hero. It's a masterfully choreographed, beautiful battle between two martial arts actors at the absolute peak of their careers. It's a sumptuous mixture of musical cues, interesting cinematography, and incredible fast-paced martial arts. It's literally impossible to watch this scene and not be completely absorbed in the world of inhuman martial arts combat. It meant that the films had a very broad potential fan base. Yes, a lot of people enjoyed them for the precise and complex fight scenes, but they had equal amounts of admirers praising the fairy tale tone, the fantastic acting, or the lush cinematography. It did, however, mean that people who saw Ang Lee's Oscar winner wouldn't necessarily look twice at Jade Empire simply because they shared the same aesthetic. To these people, Jade Empire was about as similar to Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon as Mortal Kombat or Shinobi on the Sega Mega Drive were. BioWare were used to being able to rely on a certain amount of sales via association. If you like Dungeons & Dragons, you'll probably like Neverwinter Nights. If you like Star Wars, you'll probably like Knights of the Old Republic. The same can't really be said for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and an action RPG set in an original Wuxia world. Jade Empire was never going to be able to capture the same wide appeal as its influences, so it was already destined to be a niche cult classic at best. But when paired with the launch window and the lack of marketing push, it really seems like Jade Empire was doomed before anyone had even played a second of it. But the thing is, a poor launch and niche appeal hasn't stopped other franchises from slowly building a reputation based on word of mouth alone. A quality game rarely ends up hidden forever, especially in the era of YouTube and social media, and there are a whole host of video games that have been released to middling reception only to eventually become classics. The perfect example of this is actually a game I mentioned earlier, Psychonauts, which was so beloved by its fans and so upheld as a hidden gem that it's now actually getting a sequel almost 20 years after it originally released. It's the wonderful thing about video game discussion leaving magazines and media companies and being reborn on YouTube and on social media. There's nothing stopping you from making a video extolling the virtues of that amazing game that nobody else knows about and contributing to the buzz, even 15 years later. So Jade Empire initially sold badly because of a poorly planned launch and some unfortunate assumptions about its potential popularity. But that only answers the question as to why it didn't sell well initially. If it was really as good as its reviews said it was, wouldn't word of mouth have eventually spread along with calls for a sequel? Where's the Psychonauts-esque movement to get a sequel made, especially in the modern internet era where interest can be directly measured in views and likes? The answer lies in the game itself, and how its smash reviews don't actually paint the full picture of what it's like to play through Jade Empire. We're going to split our analysis in half. First up, the things that Jade Empire does well. After all, it must have done something to earn those fantastic reviews and all those Game of the Year nods. Secondly, we're going to dive deep into the guts of the game and look at why ultimately enough went wrong to kill any calls for a sequel. Jade Empire really is a game that puts its best foot forward, as the star of the show is the Empire itself. In almost every single interview about its development, BioWare developers speak about just how important creating a new world was to them, and how launching a completely new IP would only work if people really felt interested and connected to the setting. As with any RPG worth its salt, they live and die on their story and their world, so Jade Empire's had to be good. Fortunately, it's pretty great. The game takes place entirely within the borders of the Empire, and despite containing most of the typical RPG locations, monster-filled caves, towns full of quests, and a bustling, multi-staged Imperial city at the centre, it also contains some really unusual and inventive locations for the player to explore. You visit an Imperial palace that floats high in the clouds, an ever-present symbol of the power of the Emperor over his people, which can only be reached by expensive flying machines. You'll enroll in fighting schools that sit deep in the mountains, picking sides between factions of students and fighting your way up the ranks. You discuss philosophy and drink tea in the tranquil scholars' garden, engaging in debates with travellers from all across the world. You even eventually visit the astral plane of the gods, and converse with spirits who keep the world turning. A huge amount of work was put into the art design of the game to help it realise the ambition of the world builders, with a particular focus placed on making sure Jade Empire stood out from the legions of European medieval role-playing games. Art director Matt Goldman, in an interview with GameSpy in 2004, described how virtually every era of Chinese history was drawn upon to create the unique aesthetic of Jade Empire. Sun period monumental landscapes provide a model for the ideal landscape. Tang period green style paintings are a model for the ideal colour palette. I think we have a particularly nice homage to the Huang Shan area. Shang and Zhou period bronze was used to represent an ancient lost civilization. It all comes together to create a game that really tries to push the Xbox into a look that wasn't really found on any other game on the system. Vast mountainside vistas sprawl around cloudy temples, and the wind howls in cavernous imperial tombs. When Matt Goldman says, "I think the art direction was pretty decent," he's doing his team a discredit. If the main appeal of playing RPGs is to see the imagination of creative people in full swing, Jade Empire definitely hits that mark. And it's not just the visuals either. Something else I'm a huge fan of is that the setting definitely avoids a lot of the cliches that often come hand in hand with an imperial fantasy setting. For starters, the world of Jade Empire is, generally speaking, a peaceful land to live in. Most of the epic wars have been fought by kings and soldiers many generations ago, and the Empire exists essentially unchallenged. Threats and danger are usually confined to a local level. Maybe a pirate group is raiding a town and managing to escape the local police force, or a tea house has been taken over by a scam artist. It might make it feel like the stakes are low and unexciting, but in my opinion, it creates a nice sense of realism. How often were the large empires of history really under threat, on the cusp of mass war or upheaval? It's actually very unique to create an RPG in an imperial setting and ask the question, who's good and who's bad when the kingdom's at peace? On top of this, the lore and magic of the world is actually a fair bit more interesting than it looks on the surface. This isn't just a kung fu world of rice farmers and wandering merchants. Unlike more typical fantasy settings, monsters are much more than simple enemies to be killed in combat. It's a world where it's totally normal to see spirits roaming around, to encounter demons or heavenly creatures, both of which have their own agendas which don't necessarily line up with the world of man. The balance between spirit and human world is actually the main focus of much of the story. What happens to the human world when spirits can't get to the afterlife? That being said, it's not solely rooted in fantasy magic. You meet inventors keen to bring industry and machinery into the world, creating flying machines that allow trade and transport around the vast distances of the Empire. An arms race rages between criminal and governmental factions, both battling to amass the most powerful ships or harness the power of ancient golems. Commerce and economics is a huge concern for the ruling administrators, with the acquisition of wealth never presented as something wholly good or evil. Money corrupts people, but it also lifts the peasants of the Empire out of poverty. It never devolves into the obvious technology versus spiritual, which has plagued so many fantasy stories throughout the years. It's simply a world where these things exist in tandem. Yes, ghosts exist, but also flying machines. This refusal to be drawn into moralistic debate is actually one of the world's big strengths. There's very little good and evil, just people and creatures trying to make their way in the world. Which brings me on to one of Jade Empire's strongest elements is its approach to video game morality, and BioWare's attempts to break the good and evil system that it helped cement with Knights of the Old Republic. For those not in the know, Knights of the Old Republic simulated being on the light or dark side of the Force by giving the player constant dialogue choices to make which represented either side. A beggar asks for money, and you can either give him money or help with his issue, giving you light side points, or beat him and take his money, giving you dark side points. The system was actually much more than a tool to give flavour to the dialogue though, with abilities being gated behind certain light or dark thresholds, and large story moments that would play out differently depending on where your loyalties lay. It was a fantastic system that has essentially become the de facto video game morality system, but it wasn't without its problems. The issue is that presenting all morality as either objectively good or bad is pretty cartoonishly absurd. It's fine for a setting like Star Wars where good guys are saints and bad guys are literally the devil, but maybe it doesn't work when trying to make a game that wants to tackle some heftier questions. BioWare really wanted to refine this system further and add more depth to the decisions that the player had to make. Designer Kevin Martin, when talking to IGN, described it like this: "What's evil to one person is practical to another. What's clearly the right thing to do to one group of people is purely evil to another. The player is presented with these competing views on what is right and what is wrong all the time, and must often choose between them. The player often has a chance to explain or give reasons for his choices, and how those actions are justified reveals what side of the philosophical fence the individual falls on." I think the best example of this design philosophy being used to fantastic effect is during a quest called The Scientist, which happens during the midpoint of the game. While exploring the Imperial Necropolis, you discover a doctor called Mad Wen Zi, whose daughter is dying of a degenerative liver disease. Within the Empire itself, medicine isn't really practiced, and instead people are nursed back to health by Qi healers. Wen Zi claims to know how to take the organs of a healthy person and replace those of the sick, thus curing them, essentially discovering organ transplants. In the world of the Jade Empire though, desecrating a body like this is seen as completely wrong. It prevents that person from reaching the spirit world if their body is incomplete, which has led Mad Wen Zi to being cast out by his peers. But now his daughter is dying, and he begs you to help him break this taboo in order to save her life. It sounds like an interesting premise to a bog-standard fetch quest, but actually the game gives you a huge amount of different ways to tackle the problem, largely depending on how you personally feel about the doctor's situation. Sitting in a world of advanced medicine in 2021, you might be tempted to think, well, the Jade Empire are wrong for being against transplants. Let's go get the liver and save the girl. But remember, spirits are very much real in this world. Maybe taking apart a body really would prevent some innocent person from reaching the afterlife, which, again, does very much exist in this game. Of course, the game also gives you an option to take the liver from a recently zombified nobleman, who by all accounts was a pretty awful person, so who cares if he never reaches eternity, right? Well, when you actually meet him, you're given the option to try and convince him to give it up on his own and redeem himself of his evil ways, saving 2 souls in theory, but potentially damning both of them. You could just take the liver by force, but doing this taints it, leading to the operation not going correctly, forcing the player into making a decision between saving the doctor, who might have discovered a procedure which could save many others' lives, or honouring his request to do everything possible to save his daughter. It doesn't even end there. If none of the above sound like the right decision to you, you're actually able to discover a second doctor who, intrigued by the idea of the procedure and similarly outcast by the medical community, will agree to perform the operation. In this instance, however, the doctor is forced to give up his own liver, dying to save his daughter, but preventing any innocents from being killed or harmed in the process. It's the stuff of role-playing dreams, and is so beautifully orchestrated to give the player a sense of real decision-making. Ultimately, you're just rewarded with XP points, regardless of the route you take, but it gives a real opportunity to feel like you're making actual decisions, and not just choosing between ludicrously saintly and cartoonishly villainous. The idea of moral ambiguity isn't something simply confined to quests though. It's actually woven into the world building in a really unique way that wasn't at all common in RPGs at the time. The Empire itself is consistently presented as both a force for good and evil, and never really comes to any true conclusions about if its existence is a good or bad thing for the citizens who live within it. One of the main quest hubs during the first half of the game is the lakeside town of Tien's Landing, a formerly booming trading outpost which unfortunately collapsed into poverty during the Great Drought, which was a cataclysmic drought which devastated the Empire's agriculture and caused thousands of people to starve. Emperor Sun Hai, the current ruler, was actually able to end the Great Drought, with the mystery of exactly how he did this central to the plot of the main game. The issue for the people of Tien's Landing was that in order to get this new source of water to them, it necessitated creating a new dam which would divert water over the location of the old town. The Empire put up money for a new town to be created for the citizens to move into, but of course some people refused to move, unable to believe that their all-loving hero of an emperor would do anything like destroying the homes that their families had lived in for generations. Eventually, the water was diverted and Tien's Landing, which you spend a good few hours questing in, was born anew. While the townspeople were saved and given new homes, Tien's Landing struggled to return to its former glory, the scars of those who were left behind haunting the rebuilding process, metaphorically and literally, with horrible ghosts attacking anyone who gets too close to the old town. Considering this is just the background to the second town you end up in, around an hour into the game, it's really quite amazing how tied into the central concept of different versions of morality it is. The ghosts see themselves as victims, betrayed by the Emperor to create his grand municipal project. And it's hard not to sympathise with them, considering they're just simple farming folk who serve the Empire dutifully. On the other hand, they were given ample warning and resources to make their move, so is the Empire really to blame? While dealing with the bureaucrats who run Tien's Landing, you discover that the Empire tends to send its least capable servants out to the borderlands, preferring to keep the most effective administrators working in the developed heartlands. It means that simple incompetence might have harmed the evacuation process. Maybe the arguments about leaving Old Tien's Landing weren't made strongly enough, or force wasn't used when maybe it should have. It's a million miles from the expectations we usually have of a fantasy role-playing setting, where a town's issues are largely black and white and are generally resolved by killing some monster or retrieving some lost artifact. While the player can choose to leave Tien's Landing in a much better state than they discover it, ultimately the fate of the town and how it moves on from its past is beyond the power of a kung fu master to resolve. You can take out pirates and uncover fraud, but you can't stop generations of ingrained bitterness. It's a strikingly realistic take on a fantasy world, and the way it uses ambiguous morality to paint a picture of a world full of nuance is absolutely one of the main reasons to play Jade Empire. That's not to say it operates at this higher level throughout the whole game, but I'm yet to see any other AAA console RPGs really attempt to be as human or realistic with the choices they ask you to make. If there is anything underrated about BioWare's Kung Fu epic, it's definitely this nuanced take on right and wrong. Something I really like about how Jade Empire is written is that it isn't afraid to balance out all these deep questions with just some good old-fashioned silliness. Because Jade Empire is a fairly short game by RPG standards, they could so easily have just copied the serious tones of the films and books that inspired the main quest, producing a game that's incredibly serious and leans completely on the darker side of their world, all ghosts and murder and betrayal. Now don't get me wrong, that's a completely valid way to write a story, and there's an entire market for grim dark fantasy stories that pile misery on top of misery, but Jade Empire is much better for its more varied tone, and a lot of the light-hearted moments are some of the most memorable parts of the game. It doesn't get much more light-hearted than casting John Cleese of Monty Python and Fawlty Towers fame as a wandering conquistador who's challenging the scholars of the Imperial City to prove that they aren't savages. It could so easily be another moral discussion about the differences between a Western Imperial Society and an Eastern Imperial Society, but what a waste of John Cleese that would be. Instead, Sir Roderick debates people by getting drunk, insulting people's way of life, and using an outlandishly huge rifle to blow apart anyone who tries to move him on. The whole thing is just absurd. He's got a slice of cheese stitched to his chest, and has taken a squire who he's renamed Percival, apparently much better off now as he was previously just planting weeds in the mud and not wearing proper trousers. What's particularly funny is that the scholars are so thrown off by his gaudy behaviour that they're willing to try all manner of strategies to get him to leave. You actually originally discover the issue by being insulted by someone in the street. If you respond angrily, he'll let you know that he was sent out to insult random people and find someone who wouldn't accept being slandered. Apparently the scholars thought this was the ideal way to find someone who could actually debate Sir Roderick. Some of the insults he throws at you are just so hilariously weird. You have an incredible physique. You must be an impoverished peasant, as a nobleman could afford sloth. It's just hilarious that these are the insults that the stuffy and upright scholars think would really rile people up. After confronting the Outlander, Sir Roderick claims he's grown tired of debates with people who can't grow proper mustaches, and agrees that he'll leave, but only if you can properly outwit him in a battle of ideas and best him in a physical contest. Your silly dances and slaps versus his gun, of course. The debate itself is actually quite a clever puzzle, rather than a legitimate debate. There are 5 judges, and depending on the tone of the answer you give, different judges will switch to supporting either you or Roderick. You can't convince everyone with every answer, so it's about making sure that the answers you give don't convert too many judges against you. You can work out which judges like which answers by speaking to them beforehand, but it's actually a pretty tough puzzle. I had to try it quite a few times and make notes to refer to, which is something I didn't expect from a Kung Fu RPG. When you finally put the smackdown on Sir Roderick, he reveals that not only does he have to leave, but under the Duchess of Almsbottom's rules of engagement, he now has to give you a gift. You've got the choice of a few things, but honestly, who wouldn't take the massive gun, which is as hilariously unwieldy as it looks? Borderline useless in actual combat, but just hilarious that it's even there as an option. The whole scenario is just great use of John Cleese, who's perfectly cast as the hyper-arrogant invader who's completely unaware of how rude he's being. It's got to be up there with the greatest video game cameos of all time. My personal favourite weird moment is a quest you can get just before things start to become really relentlessly serious in the second half of the game. While wandering the streets of the capital, you can become embroiled in a tricky situation thanks to a distressed playwright. In short, he's written a historical play that's being performed later on, but unfortunately it's caught the attention of the Lotus Assassins, who consider the content of the play to be seditious. A disgruntled actor has rewritten the play to be a satire of the origins of the Empire, rather than a drama about the human condition. Now the quest is really set up for the player to have to make a moral choice. Do they perform the play as it was rewritten, endangering the performing troupe but raising the curtain on the injustices of the Empire? Or do they change the lines back and save the livelihood of the actors, but at the cost of your integrity? An interesting choice, only there's a third option. You can instead choose to completely derail the play, ad-libbing your own lines, some of which are pretty damn funny. You can claim to be psychic, that the expansion of the Empire was halted because of boredom, or just give completely wrong lines altogether. It's funny because giving the goofy answers actually works as a resolution. The Lotus Assassins just leave, confused about why anyone would want to watch such a terrible play, sparing the lives of the performers, but vowing to kill the informant for wasting their time. Call me old-fashioned, but it's just nice to have some moments of levity among all the intense mystic storytelling. It's what makes the Jade Empire such a well-rounded setting. It's not just intensity and darkness, but it's full of goofy moments that make a smile break out as you read them. It's not laugh out loud funny, but really, what video games are. Well, actually, one moment did make me laugh out loud. There's a character called Chandler Ling, who has absolutely nothing to do with Chandler Bing from Friends. I've got no idea why I found this so funny, and I have no idea why I wanted to include it in this critique so badly, but here it is. Chandler Ling, the funniest character in Jade Empire, and I have no idea why. Something else which helps Jade Empire live on in the minds of IGN list makers or small YouTubers is that a lot of the ideas that underpin the actual gameplay form a pretty valiant attempt at meshing the worlds of fast-paced martial arts with role-playing customization. When you encounter an enemy, combat seamlessly starts without anything resembling a loading screen, and you're thrust into an action RPG system that seems to take more influence from the likes of Devil May Cry and Ninja Gaiden than Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale. Attacking is broken up into light and heavy attacks, the latter of which is very slow indeed, but can break a guarding enemy and stun them. You can of course put up your own guard, which works by the same rules. Take a glowing heavy attack to the face, and you'll be knocked over and open to damage. Your final battlefield action is a pretty monstrous acrobatic dodge, which you can use to either jump behind an enemy or dodge off to the side. To be totally honest, it's an extremely basic action game system, much more akin to something found in action platformers, rather than something you'd expect from the follow-up to Knights of the Old Republic's hosts of special moves and class-based combat. Where the game introduces some complexity and strategy is in the implementation of its styles. By exploring the world, completing quests, or literally paying for training from specific masters, your character can learn different styles which change the manner or effect of those light and heavy attacks. There's actually a pretty broad range of differing moves you can learn, 22 different styles in fact, which range from different martial arts to weapons you can wield, styles that put debuffs on enemies or hit them from range with elemental magic. The most iconic of these styles is clearly the transformation styles, which morph you into a huge demonic form. In this case, a toad, who swipes at enemies with his disgusting frog arms. These individual styles grow in power as you level up by investing points into them, and different elements can be improved, such as speed, damage, or prolonging debuffs. It's a basic but satisfying power curve. You beat people up to gain levels to get better at beating people up. You meet a guy who can shoot ice out of his hands, maybe he'll teach you how to do it for a price. You meet a guy who throws drinks out onto the battlefield which you consume to become a Jackie Chan style drunken master. Why not? It's simple, but it's charming. Another simple but elegant system is the actual stats that underpin Jade Empire's character customization. Gone are the huge tables from Dungeons & Dragons or Knights of the Old Republic, and in its place is a simple 3-stat system. You have body, which governs how much health you have, spirit, which governs how much chi you have, which is a sort of like a mana pool for spells but can also be used to heal yourself, and finally you have mind, which dedicates how much focus you have. As this is an early 2000s Kung Fu game, it of course has a bullet time mechanic, which is tied to how much focus you have. For some reason this also governs how long you can use weapons for, which are incredibly powerful but are a timed resource. More on that later. Before we're deafened by accusations of BioWare selling out to the casual crowd, I've got to say that I really think this simplification works really well. Not just because it's easy to get your head around, but because those 3 stats actually serve a secondary role as dialogue checks in many conversations you have. Instead of just having an arbitrary charisma stat that's totally separate from the rest of your character, why not have it so that if you have a really high body stat, you're able to intimidate people with your physical presence? The same thing goes for convincing scholars of your philosophical arguments. It's only going to work if you have a really high mind stat and are playing an intelligent, learned character. Again, it's simple, it's streamlined, but the way it's implemented in the game feels natural and satisfying. I think it would be impossible to discuss the parts of Jade Empire that work without talking about its much lauded narrative. Despite all the interesting design decisions behind the combat or world building, ultimately the main reason to play a role-playing game is because of the exciting narrative. It's also basically impossible to discuss why exactly it's good without getting into spoilers. So, spoilers for Jade Empire and Knights of the Old Republic. During the late 90s and early 2000s, BioWare managed to carve out a really interesting niche when it came to the storytelling style of their games. Unlike other studios that were often influenced by a specific genre or kind of film, they instead became known for telling stories that always contained a mind-bending twist. Now, they weren't the first studio to ever design their game's story around a twist, but they were one of the absolute best at executing it. Video game twists tended to be mostly hard left-field pivots, which the player couldn't have possibly seen coming. A great example of this is Wesker's betrayal in Resident Evil 1. You spend virtually the whole game thinking he's simply the leader of STARS, only to discover he's actually working for Umbrella during the ending. Don't get me wrong, it's a classic video game moment, but it's not exactly a great twist because it doesn't really redefine your experience. The very best twists mean you go back and watch a film or read a book again with a fresh perspective, noticing the little nods that your brain missed that could have pointed you to the truth. While Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights had unexpected twisting plots, Knights of the Old Republic is really where this reputation exploded, as they put together something that stands toe-to-toe with the most famous surprises of all of film and TV. Essentially, without wanting to spend 30 minutes talking about how amazing the story of Knights of the Old Republic is, the twist is that you're in fact not a faceless avatar for the player, but you're actually the main villain of the story, Darth Revan. The whole game hasn't been your player character waking up to their potential as a Jedi, but it's actually a lengthy reconditioning by the Jedi Council, trying to reprogram their greatest enemy into a secret weapon. The reveal is amazingly well done, considering the restrictions in graphics and animation at the time, but it goes beyond that. Playing through Knights of the Old Republic a second time reveals all these little moments that you'd simply just look past the first time through the game. People are consistently impressed with how quickly you're able to learn the ways of the Force, or surprised that the Jedi agreed to train an adult at all. Moments where you're able to activate an ancient Sith machine aren't just the good fortune of the main character, but a Revan literally turning on his own creations with muscle memory. It's absolutely fascinating to replay in a way no other Western RPG is. Despite the constant name-checking of Chinese mythological classics from the developers in Jade Empire's marketing, its biggest narrative influence is clearly this element of Knights of the Old Republic. BioWare had clearly hit on a narrative formula that they felt really comfortable with. Jade Empire was planned to hit exactly the same beats: characters with mysterious pasts, villains with ambiguous morality, and on top of it all, another fantastic twist. After choosing one of 6 preset characters to serve as the protagonist of your story, you're introduced to a martial arts school in the quiet coastal town of Two Rivers on the edge of the Empire. Despite being an orphan with no family or history, you're the star pupil of Master Li, and enjoy a special relationship with the headmaster, who spends extra time coaching your abilities much to the jealousy of other pupils. These other pupils include the obvious romantic interest of the game, Dawn Star, and the highly jealous and competitive Gal the Lesser, who is inexplicably voiced by Nathan Fillion, despite only being in the game for about an hour. The relative tranquility of meditation, learning, and training is broken when bandits, led by the Empire's much-feared Lotus Assassins, raid the town. The raid is repelled by students, but Master Li is extremely troubled by the appearance of the Lotus Assassins, and decides it's time to reveal the truth behind yours and his identity. He is no mere martial arts teacher, but is actually Sun Li, the glorious strategist, brother of the Emperor himself, long thought dead, but actually deep in hiding in Two Rivers. The Emperor, in his desperation to end the long drought, invaded the city of Dirge, home of the Water Dragon and her spirit monks, slaying all that were found there and taking the magical power of the dragon for himself. An opportunistic power grab masked as a last resort to save the Empire. Your master, Sun Li, disgusted with his brother's actions, abandoned his post and fled with the last remaining spirit monk, a baby saved from the slaughter of his people, none other than you. Master Li tells you that this is his long fermenting plan, to train the last spirit monk to be the finest warrior in the land, to go on a lengthy quest to restore the power of the amulet of the water dragon, and defeat the emperor who has corrupted the natural order of the world. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Gal the Lesser also overhears this conversation, and after being humiliated following the bandit raid, decides to enact a vicious revenge. You see, the lesser part of his name refers to his father, a local crime boss, Gao the Greater, who's in league with the Lotus Assassins, and has access to a whole bunch of men and a whole bunch of firepower. While away on the first part of your Spirit Monk quest, Gao the Greater's men attack the village, killing everyone, townsfolk and students alike, capturing Master Li and destroying your home, leaving you with no choice but to head out into the Empire and begin your grand quest alone. A journey to save your master from the Lotus Assassins and realize your potential as the last hope for humanity. Okay, so this sounds pretty much as bog standard as is possible for a fantasy story to be. You're the chosen one, last bastion of a holy order that can stop the natural order from being destroyed by a power-hungry monarch. Hometown's destroyed, mentors captured, so you've got no choice but to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. And the thing is, it is bog standard. While the world is interesting to explore, and the quests are inventively put together, the broad strokes of the story that guide you from chapter to chapter really are nothing particularly special. It's once you're high above the Imperial City, in the climactic showdown with the Emperor, that Jade Empire's story bursts into life, more than making up for its generic opening with a twist that stands up to the best in BioWare's catalogue. So far, everything is run essentially as you'd expect. You go from Two Rivers to the slightly bigger town of Tien's Landing, and then onto the massive Imperial City. Quests get more complicated, you meet more followers, beat up a whole bunch of pretty bad dudes, which eventually all culminates in a showdown in the floating Imperial Palace with the Emperor. You follow the trail of the Lotus Assassins, and over the course of about 15 hours of questing and fighting, everything has led to this point. All throughout the fight, which is the toughest in the game, the Emperor is rambling about how he's a god and about how the Jade Empire needs him to survive, so it feels like you're doing the world a pretty big favour by taking him out. When you eventually slash that sword through him one final time, it really seems like you've saved the day. Upon killing Sun Hai, ending the oppression of the Lotus Assassins, and freeing your master, Sun Li approaches the throne and congratulates you on all your hard work and all the effort you'd gone to in your journey. He turns around and kills you where you stand. I mean, holy shit. What a freaking twist. You see, Sun Li had wanted the throne from the very start and had pushed Sun Hai to capture the water dragon, feeding him tales of how it was the only way to save the Empire from the drought, hoping that he'd be able to steal the power for himself. Despite careful planning, his coup failed, and Sun Li was forced into hiding, having to adopt a much more long-term and subversive plot. By training the last Spirit Monk from birth, he'd be able to craft the perfect weapon to depose the Emperor, and by filling his head with tales of a corrupt man abusing the Empire, he'd guarantee the creation of a chosen one who would do anything to destroy the power structures of the Empire. It's a brilliant twist that redefines the initial setup that we discussed earlier. It's a bog-standard Chosen One story because that's exactly the narrative that Sun Li has fed you. It's actually a really clever way of being able to take the best elements of a simple fantasy story, but still being able to do the unexpected in the final act. It goes one step further though. Throughout the game you'll meet various martial arts masters who often comment on what a strange fighting style you have. It happens just enough for you to notice it on a second playthrough, but gloss over it the first time around. And frankly, even if you do notice it, it's extremely easy to read this as martial arts masters simply being amazed at how brilliant you, the Chosen One, really are. But it's all part of the twist. You have a strange fighting style because Master Li has trained a flaw into your style, one that only he knows how to exploit. It's pure kung fu movie nonsense in the most fantastic way possible. It's a narrative surprise that's easily up there with Knights of the Old Republic's Revan reveal, and genuinely floored me the first time I saw it. Imagine if deep in the Mines of Moria, Gandalf pushed Frodo to his doom and took the ring for himself, leaving everyone for dead, and revealing the whole fellowship to have been an evil ploy. Imagine Merlin betraying King Arthur because he was after Excalibur all along. It's a fantastic twist primarily because it plays off of those expectations of the fantasy genre, which were especially strong in video games at the time. This was a time of Fable, Dragon Quest, and The Legend of Zelda, where learned old men give you honest advice and help you take out villains who are definitely not also being manipulated. The fact that the first 2/3 of Jade Empire play out in such spectacularly predictable fashion is exactly what makes this twist work so well, and it's absolutely the standout element of the whole game. We'll leave how the rest of the game resolves to a later section of the video, but this is an ideal time to deliver a shocking twist of our own in the tale of why Jade Empire never got a sequel. So far, I've essentially gushed with praise about the elements that I like, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot to like about this game. It has an original and aesthetically interesting world, a valiant attempt to blend kung fu action and traditional RPG mechanics, all while delivering a smashing twist that most films would be happy with. The problem is that there is also a lot that's not great about Jade Empire. Really, there's actually quite a lot to not like. In broad strokes, Jade Empire is a pretty great game, but the issue as to why it's not better remembered really comes from the detail and polish that turns good concepts into a great experience. It's the classic example of something that sounds fantastic on paper, but lacks the execution and vision to really live up to its potential. We've spent time building the Jade Empire up. It's time to deliver the crushing throne room betrayal and bring it all crashing down. The most obvious place to start is the issue that's so obvious that the BioWare leadership themselves have acknowledged it. Earlier in the video, I showed part of an interview with Dr. Greg Zishuk, freely admitting that he'd have preferred it if the game could have been pushed back to release on the Xbox 360 and been polished up. Essentially, it's a diplomatic way of saying there are some parts of the game that legitimately look quite bad and feel pretty underdeveloped. Now, I am absolutely not the sort of person to criticize a game for having poor graphics simply because it's old. In fact, I'm a firm believer that an original and inventive art style is worth 1,000 polygons. Games like Chrono Cross and Final Fantasy IX are sumptuous visual feasts compared to the high-definition sepia nightmare of games like Gears of War or Resident Evil 6. The problem is that the original Xbox just simply doesn't have the power to be able to realise what BioWare's artists and designers envisaged when creating this world. Huge vistas of cloud-filled valleys should sprawl out below mountaintop temples, but instead everything just looks murky as the poor draw distance keeps most of the visuals in the foreground. It means you never really get a proper feel for the scale of the Jade Empire, and you're constantly running around on pathways with raised banks or walls to mask the fact that only a small area of the game is ever loaded at once. It's even worse in a setting like the Imperial City, where every section of what is supposed to be a sprawling metropolis is sectioned off and penned in by walls. There's never actually a moment where you can get up high and look out over your surroundings, which is pretty majorly disappointing when all of the lore is about an eternal empire that runs shore to shore, and you never actually properly get to see it. Finally reaching the Emperor's floating palace and being unable to actually look down on the Empire is one of the biggest missed opportunities in the game's entire development. Although, I've got to emphasise, it's quite clearly because of a lack of resource rather than a design choice. The same thing even applies to the skies themselves. So much of the world is built around the idea of flying machines and how control of the routes through the Empire's dangerous winds is such an important part of the Imperial economy. Sadly, it's not part of the world we ever really get to experience. Flying is reduced to a scrolling, shoot-'em-up style minigame, or even a short pre-rendered cutscene, which means the majority of the game is rooted firmly to the ground. Even the skyboxes are generally just blurry, dark shapes with clouds, rather than anything otherworldly or unique, which ironically helps put players off of looking to the sky and wishing to soar through them. This kneecapping by the hardware also frustratingly shows itself in how the game's various environments are put together. There are loading screens absolutely everywhere, to the point where there are literally 54 different graphics used to load the game behind. It means there isn't really a sense of connection between any of the zones or locations you visit. While it doesn't feel completely odd to walk up to a large tea house, hit A to enter it, and get a quick loading screen before going in, it feels extremely weird to walk up to an open pathway or cave entrance and have to wait before it loads. On top of this, to mask the fact that you've literally loaded into a new zone, you'll often start part way into the map, which just adds to a general sense of disorientation and lack of place. Even when you're inside some of the larger maps, small loading bars will often appear and pause your momentum, meaning it's essentially impossible to feel like this is one cohesive world and not just a series of levels. This might sound like I'm being overly harsh on an older game, but you've got to realise that even at the time, this was something that wasn't found in the majority of RPGs, especially those trying to create seamless worlds to explore. Nobody likes staring at a bar slowly filling up, and it's a hammer blow when trying to create immersion or engross someone in your world. Final Fantasy X is a really apt comparison because the two games follow a relatively similar formula, focusing on enclosed, detailed areas that are linked together in a linear order, rather than something like Elder Scrolls, which is extremely open. Final Fantasy X released 4 years earlier and has virtually no loading screens, going almost seamlessly from location to location, battle to cutscene, in-game dialogue to exploration, all while covering up the few loading times it does have with stylistic little cinematic moments. It's the difference between a company like Square Enix, seasoned veterans who knew how to build a game like this, and BioWare, who are only on their second ever console game. The implementation of the infamous lift scenes to disguise loading times in BioWare's next game, Mass Effect, surely is as good as an admission that they knew they'd messed up here and needed to work out a way to stitch their worlds together without ripping the player out of the experience constantly. This disconnection from the world itself also bleeds into the actual experience of playing through the game, as Jade Empire is completely and absolutely linear, constantly pushing the player onwards to the next story beat with virtually zero optional areas, side dungeons, or secret bosses. It's a huge step back from Knights of the Old Republic, which at around a quarter of the way through the game opened up to being essentially non-linear and letting the player feel like they were exploring the galaxy at will. That same sense of exploration is pretty much completely absent here. Once you reach a location in Jade Empire, it essentially serves as a hub for the main story quest and a handful of side quests which you can pick up. It's not exactly linear in the sense of a game like Mario World, where your only gameplay option is to move forwards, but it's certainly linear for an RPG, and once the hub is cleared, you really do have absolutely no reason to go back to that area. The hubs themselves link to smaller side zones, which effectively serve as the more combat-orientated areas where questing actually takes place, and unfortunately, generally speaking, they're extremely limited and uninteresting. During Chapter 2, while helping cleanse a forest of evil spirits near Tien's Landing, you're able to align yourself with a member of the Celestial Bureaucracy, a kind of spirit government that makes sure everything runs according to the natural order of things. The spirit of the forest asks you to journey into the Celestial Realm and help with a war raging between demons and spirits, which of course you as the last spirit monk are pretty well equipped to help resolve. Journey into the Celestial Realm is absolutely one of the high points of the game from a visual perspective. It's an almost glowing location, floating amidst swirling clouds with otherworldly vegetation growing out of rivers that flow from nowhere into nowhere. You fight against toad and horse demons while battling to the peak of the realm, where you can finally choose to either save the spirits or destroy them. It's a great moment to play through, but ultimately, after finishing the game, I'm largely left with a sense of frustration that we see so little of this place. No conversing with spiritual bureaucrats, no exploring the heavenly cities, no petty squabbles of wraiths to resolve, just a linear march through a few combat encounters and then a conversation that dumps you straight back into the forest. It's disappointing in the extreme, because the potential in visiting the astral plane is so enticing, and yet it's really hardly used. We get 4 entire levels set inside of cave systems, and only 10 minutes spent learning about something that's legitimately unique to Jade Empire. Part of the issue is that due to the way the environments are designed, they're only really set up to accommodate one quest or set of events. Almost every single zone is effectively a series of corridors that link wider circular rooms where combat takes place. It doesn't matter if it's a forest, caves, or a tomb, they really all follow this exact same formula, and it does get pretty tedious by the 4th or 5th borderline identical zone, especially when you're having to backtrack all the way to the entrance after completing a quest. The lack of ambition in map design is actually quite ridiculous when you think about all the influences that Jade Empire could have drawn upon when designing locations. There's no wide open plains with lots of skirmishes breaking out for you to get engaged in. There's no bamboo forest that requires you to stealthily avoid Lotus assassins. There's no wire food duels soaring high above a lake, like that famous scene from Crouching Tiger. It's one visit to a zone for a small dose of corridors, small-scale combat, and then you're out of there. It makes the zones of Jade Empire feel extremely gamey, which is one of the worst things you can level at the design of a video game world. Escapism is absolutely driven by having a variety of things to do within a game space, and Jade Empire is simply too linear for its quest zones to feel at all memorable. The problem goes further than that though. BioWare is also trying to have their cake and eat it. Just before the climax of the game, you unlock the ability to travel freely between any location you've visited in your journey so far. It's essentially the "you've got an airship" moment that's so famously in every old school JRPG. You've been travelling along a set path, feet rooted to the ground, but now the world opens up and you can fly back to pastures familiar. The issue is that there's absolutely no reason to do this. Because of the linearity of the game up until this point, it's pretty massively unlikely that anyone would have missed any quests, as most are tied into the zones that you visit during the main story. There isn't any shops to visit or optional dungeons, and nothing new unlocks once you get the flyer, meaning a trip back to Tien's Landing or Two Rivers is really just for the sake of sightseeing. In fact, it's almost like the game doesn't even want you to do this, as the main story is generally framed as pretty urgent. We've got to go face the Emperor to rescue Master Li as soon as possible after all. It's just a really weird tonal clash. This is a game absolutely not built around exploration, and yet it has this function baked into it and makes a huge deal about it. It's almost as if BioWare was too scared after the free-form structure of their previous games to ask their players to strap into something so constrained. It means the whole game is haunted by the spectre of the Empire, a really interesting and original setting that we simply just don't get to see enough of. It's absolutely crying out for more meaningful optional areas and combat zones that aren't just a straight dash to the quest marker. Unfortunately, the single meaningful optional area in the game, where BioWare tries to break the gameplay formula up, is also arguably the worst location in the whole game, and really highlights some of the issues BioWare had with actually realizing their vision. Once you arrive in the Imperial City, you're able to enroll in the Black Leopard School, the most renowned martial arts school in the entire Empire. You quickly discover that all is not well within the ranks of the Black Leopard community. The school is currently embroiled in a deep civil war. The students have split into two factions, one group following Master Radiant and the other following Master Smiling Hawk. You see, historically there's only ever been one master at a time, and the school is currently tearing itself apart over who the legitimate master is. As if that wasn't bad enough, members of the Brotherhood, who are the senior students tasked with maintaining order on behalf of the masters, have been going missing without a trace. First Brother Kai, after seeing you dispatch a group of rowdy students, asks you to enlist as a student and help him uncover what's happened to the other brothers and bring an end to the strife. It all sounds like a pretty enticing setup for a questing zone. I've always thought that the school setting is absolutely perfect for RPGs, with lessons to attend which increase stats or give you new abilities, and teachers to impress with your charisma, and student factions to either fight or align with. Games like Persona and Fire Emblem have used this formula to create literal classics, so the idea of a mini version of this with a martial arts murder mystery twist couldn't sound better. Unfortunately, the spectre of overambition once again haunts the game, delivering a zone which in reality feels completely unfinished. The school itself is absolutely tiny, with literally nothing to explore or find within its ugly grey walls. There's a mess hall with nothing interactable in it, an open courtyard that's only meant to accommodate one-on-one fights, and a few sparsely detailed dorm rooms. You might be expecting too much to ask for something that rivals Bulworth Academy, but when it only takes 10 seconds to fully explore the zone, the excitement about solving a mystery or enrolling at the school diminishes hard and fast. This is also a great time to bring up just how awfully the lore in Jade Empire is delivered. Rather than information about the world being a reward for inquisitive conversation with NPCs or baked into quests, almost every bit of detail about the Jade Empire that isn't used in the main story is just found on text banners that are dotted randomly around different environments. You run up to them, click A, read the text, and get a bit of XP. It's just an absurdly clumsy way of delivering all of the interesting background and fluff that makes original worlds interesting in the first place. Yes, nobody reads all of the books in Morrowind or Oblivion, but the fact that you can actually learn about ancient Elvish history by reading ancient Elvish history books makes the world feel alive. It's just another undercooked feature that's particularly frustrating because a lot of the lore in this game is actually really funny and interesting. It's just had all of the fun sapped out of it by being delivered like a revision textbook. Anyway, back to the Black Leopard School. For all of the praise I gave earlier, specifically for how much creativity was found in the Surgeon quest, the Black Leopard School shows the other half of the coin. A hyper-simplistic and borderline nonsensical quest that shares more in common with NES RPGs than complex PC games. Essentially, you need to defeat 6 brothers in one-on-one combat in order to meet the Masters and resolve the story. And that's literally it. No murder mystery, no martial arts classes, no breaking curfew to spy on opposing factions or sneaking into dorms to find evidence. Just 6 extremely easy one-on-one duels in the courtyard. The brothers themselves aren't even varied opponents. You just wail away on them with your strongest style, and you can beat all 6 in literally seconds. It's underwhelming in the extreme. It doesn't get any better when you finally meet the Masters and get to the bottom of the mystery. You're invited to meet Smiling Hawk in his dorm room, who immediately reveals to you that not only has he been killing the students in order to steal their power, but that he is completely and unarguably evil and totally to blame for everything that's happened in the school. All of the moral ambiguity and player agency is completely gone, and we're right back at the cartoonish morality from Knights of the Old Republic, where villains are outlandishly evil and always beyond redemption. You're given a choice to either expose Smiling Hawk to the rest of the school, or side with him and use a spell he's created to kill Master Radiant and end the conflict. Things get pretty nonsensical when you eventually meet Master Radiant a few moments later. It turns out he's a ghost. That's right, he's a straight up, who you're going to call, ghost, who's being sustained in secret by First Brother Kai. Now, apparently he was killed by Smiling Hawk, but is somehow living on as a ghost, which is also somehow preventing Smiling Hawk from taking over the school. And for some reason, it must be kept a secret. Now, I've played this section over and over recording footage for this video, and it just completely doesn't make sense. Why does Smiling Hawk need you to cast the spell for him? And how on earth does he not know where Radiant is? Their rooms are about 20 feet apart, and the school isn't exactly full of places to hide. Equally, why doesn't Master Radiant just speak to the other students and explain what's happened? He doesn't seem to have any issue speaking to us, so why doesn't First Brother Kai just out the murderer? In the Scientist's quest, Mad Wenzi couldn't go and get help because he was caring for his daughter and needed a stranger who wouldn't reject his views. The player is an active participant in the quest because they are the out-of-the-norm difference that allows the quest to happen. I'm genuinely unsure why anyone needs us to do anything in the Black Leopard School, other than simply just because we're the main character and we have to be involved. It's just clearly all contrived to give the illusion of choice, while in actuality, just creates busy work for the player. I decided to go with Master Radiant in the end because, you know, Smiling Hawk is clearly the bad guy, and during his boss fight, he literally absorbs the souls of some of his followers to draw more strength. Not that it really mattered anyways, I killed him in about 6 hits. Clearly they don't make them too tough at the Black Leopard School. Ultimately, it doesn't matter in the slightest. Once you're done with the Black Leopard School, no matter who you choose to become the Soul Master, you'll never return here, and your only reward is a style specific to either Radiant or Smiling Hawk, both of which are likely much worse than any other style that you've invested 10 hours of points into at this point in the game. The whole episode really highlights the key issue when it comes to the design of Jade Empire's world and quests. When BioWare are trying to break formulas and come up with creative situations, Jade Empire can be a fun and sometimes really inventive RPG to play. The second it steps back into the Knights of the Old Republic influenced comfort zone, things get extremely ropey, and it unfortunately contributes to a game that feels undercooked and looks unfinished. The same could be said for Jade Empire's various mini-games, which fall extremely flat despite obvious potential. When flying from location to location, you'll engage in an old-school top-down shoot-'em-up style mode, where you have to destroy enemy fires, collect power-ups while using special weapons, and beat bosses to progress to your destination. Sounds interesting, right? The issue is, unfortunately, these shooter sections are seriously clunky and balanced so poorly that the missions range from either ridiculously easy to eye-wateringly difficult. In my humble opinion, shoot-'em-ups are usually enjoyable either because of really tight controls and inventive design, which makes games like Ikaruga or Resogun really fun to struggle through, or going a little easier but giving the player lots of weapons to use and enemies to blow up, like in the SNES classic UN Squadron, which is a bonkers, over-the-top slaughterfest and is absolutely fantastic. It's frustrating because BioWare have clearly really tried quite hard with this mode, implementing a series of sub-weapons that you can discover throughout the game and a whole quest chain dedicated to it. It's just never actually fun enough to actually sit down and bother dedicating time to, and the fact that you can skip these levels without even attempting them seems like a sort of tactic admission that BioWare knows this as well. On top of getting you from A to B, the flying quests also tie into the other minigame that you're served up on the set menu that is Jade Empire. After discovering a mysterious wind map, you're able to access Lord Lau's Furnace, a crafting location that allows you to turn specific items that you find into permanent stat upgrades. It is without a doubt one of the worst crafting systems I've ever seen implemented in a role-playing game, and it's kind of baffling that this even made it into the final version. Unlike other games, which have you exploring to find craftable items, and then experimenting by combining those items to make gear, Jade Empire only allows you to craft once you've found one of 6 recipes that are dotted randomly throughout the game. Now these aren't given as quest rewards or sold by wandering merchants, oh no, they're literally just hidden in random chests, which means that rather than crafting being something that's constantly done throughout the game, you literally only do it if you happen upon a recipe. Easily missed as well, let me remind you. There is only 6 in the whole game. If you do accidentally stumble upon a recipe, you'll need one of 3 ingredients to be able to actually complete the recipe. How do you find these? You literally just buy them from a spirit merchant, who isn't even in an actual location that you have to travel to, but instead is inexplicably just a menu that you open from the start screen. It's just so poorly implemented that it's impossible to think that this was the actual vision for what Lord Lau's Furnace would be in the game. The rewards for miraculously completing one of these aren't much better either. They're wildly inconsistent and range from as paltry as an additional +5 mind to the absolutely game-breaking +30 focus. What's even worse is that should you actually be able to complete every single recipe, you'll be rewarded with a totally blind choice between 2 permanent upgrades, either +5 to all 3 stats or +25% damage. This is insane! +5 to every stat at the point in the game that you'd have to be at to have completed every recipe is absolutely god-awful, and +25% damage is an absolutely insane buff that essentially makes the game a complete joke in terms of difficulty. You would never choose the stats, and yet it's a blind decision that requires hours of scouring every map to even get to. I absolutely refuse to believe that anyone has gotten to this point without a walkthrough, and the fact that it also requires you to play the flying game to even unlock just means you'll be begging to get back to the main quest where at least things make a little bit more sense. I think it's admirable that BioWare tried to broaden the scope of the gameplay, but the reality is the game is at its best when it's sticking to the linear story, and really shows its cracks when we step off that path. Jade Empire isn't a long game by any stretch of the imagination, clocking in at around 15 to 20 hours to beat everything, but in reality, that's it. There's virtually no reason to stick around doing optional content or replaying the game. I don't think it's a coincidence that the biggest RPG successes on the Xbox original were Morrowind and Fable, 2 games which dedicated themselves wholly to creating large worlds with customization and side content at the heart of them. RPGs were deep into the transition from linear, narrative-driven experiences to worlds that players could really feel like they were living in. Within a few years, we'd get Oblivion and Fallout 3 on the Xbox 360, while JRPG playtimes were beginning to balloon well over 50 hours. It's easy to see why a shorter, linear experience wouldn't really capture the attention of gamers in 2004. By nature of its design, it wasn't a game that you'd be playing weekend after weekend, meaning that the natural word of mouth that built around its bigger cousins never happened. Everyone I know who played Jade Empire beat it, but I don't remember anyone even playing it at the time, because it's a game that you pick up, blast through, and then forget about. A perfect concoction for a game that makes a big impression early, but then slips away into obscurity. Jade Empire also has a serious balance problem. As we discussed earlier, the power curve of the game is defined by leveling up, which improves your core stats, and putting points into your styles, which boosts damage and speed. It's pretty easy to imagine that this should be balanced against the length of the game. You're weak at the start, and then you should be reaching your peak by the final few stages. The issue is that Jade Empire really struggles to walk this line and is ludicrously easy to break. When I played through the game for this video, without any research beforehand, I decided to go for a weapon-focused character who would stack focus, thus enabling me to use my powerful sword in each battle rather than having to keep it in reserve. As the weapons don't affect spirit enemies, I also needed to drop some points into a martial arts style, and I also took a paralysis style to be able to slow down bigger foes and bosses. So every level I gained, I put some points in health, but most of them in focus, and saved all of my style points to get my sword up to maximum damage and speed as soon as possible. Now call me naive, but after a few hours of playing it, I'd imagine the game's combat to be a fast-paced battle of positioning and choosing the right style for the right situation, getting the sword out for enemies weak to it, and switching to fists in a flash when I run low on focus, using support styles to control the flow of combat on the battlefield, and balancing healing with dodging powerful attacks. I was incredibly wrong. Jade Empire is a game about jumping over enemies and then slashing them with your sword. Within around 5 hours, I'd completely upgraded my sword and had more focus than I could ever use in a battle, meaning I was absolutely chewing through every kind of enemy in seconds and hardly ever needing to change style. Dodging was essentially only useful to get behind enemies and cut them up, and avoiding attacks is completely pointless when you can just charge in and kill everything so quickly. The whole mechanic of blocking and stunning with heavy attacks ends up completely left by the wayside because they take so long to charge up that you might as well just switch targets to someone who's vulnerable and slash away. The same goes for debuff styles. Why waste time casting sleep or paralysis on an enemy when 3 or 4 hits is enough to kill most enemies in the game? It's a tragic example of poor balancing ruining an entire combat system. Just to check I wasn't being absurd, I went back and did a second playthrough, this time focusing on a totally different style. Maybe it's just that the weapons are really overpowered and I'd accidentally broken the game. To my dismay, it was exactly the same. This time I chose 1000 Cuts as my primary style, and if anything, it was even more powerful. Now I was able to hit spirits and it had a weirdly large amount of tracking, meaning battles were over even faster. Despite this basically ruining the power curve of the game, I think it would have been salvageable if the movement in combat was far more fluid and dodging played a bigger role. Movement during combat is really surprisingly stiff, and commands are extremely deliberate, because you would have thought that having free-flowing, fast-paced action would be one of the main appeals for basing a game in this setting. Now, I have no way to know for sure, but I think part of the problem comes from BioWare's decision to base all of the combat animations on mocap taken from real martial arts masters. In G4's Making of Jade Empire documentary, it's something that the developers are genuinely really proud of, and to be fair, it's a cool idea. It lends authenticity to the movements of the characters and ends up looking far better than the wonky and stiff animations from Knights of the Old Republic. The issue is that in preserving these movements exactly as the actors performed them, we're left with a combat system that's largely built around quite lengthy predefined animations that can't be cancelled out of. It naturally means that everything is very deliberate and slow paced, waiting as animations play out in the exact same way every single time. You'll be amazed to hear that you can't even change direction once you go for a light combo or a heavy attack, meaning you can be locked into a whiff and be unable to do anything about it. On top of this, your character moves incredibly slowly around the battlefield and you can't move freely, instead only having 4 directions that you can move in based on whoever you're targeting. Being far away from your opponent is genuinely agony as your character slowly edges towards their foe, making the whole thing look more like drunks arguing in a pub than a battle of martial arts prodigies. It's disappointing because this seems like such an obvious miss for a game based around martial arts and hyper-athletic ninjas. Dodging powerful attacks by the skin of your teeth and weaving between heavily armoured targets should be Jade Empire's bread and butter, but instead, despite all of the Chinese martial arts imagery, I ended up playing the game far more like a heavily armoured European knight, slowly edging into position and then blasting away at enemies with a flurry of heavy sword blows. Another system that's incredibly weirdly implemented is the various techniques that you can discover throughout your adventure. Now, calling them techniques probably conjures images of special moves in combat or maybe abilities that aid with exploration, but unfortunately, you'd be very wrong. Instead, techniques are literally just permanent stat upgrades which you gain from completing quests or just buying them from merchants. It's kind of weird because despite this seeming like such a throwaway system, lots of effort was clearly put into justifying each technique with its own unique lore explanation, which you can read from the technique menu. It's a weird case of a lot of effort being put into the flavour, but none into its implementation, which ends up being as boring as is possible to find in an RPG. At first, it seems pretty inoffensive. That is until you realise just how many of them there are in the game. I think that techniques are supposed to be a substitute for the traditional equipment system you'd find in most RPGs. Instead of replacing different bits of armor, swapping out and replacing items for gear that you find or buy, your character simply learns more and more techniques, sort of creating a system that mimics their growth as a martial arts master. You travel around the world, encounter new challenges, and learn new ways to conquer them, which is all reflected in your techniques and thus power. The issue is that terrible balancing once again robs this system of any potential gameplay narrative synergy. By completing all of the quests and buying every technique in town, which you'll have more than enough money to do, you can easily end up with a ridiculous amount of techniques, even in the early game, which translates to a game-breakingly large permanent stat boost. Before the midpoint of the game, I essentially had enough focus to run around in the quest hubs in permanent focus sprint, go through every battle completely in bullet time, and use my hyper-powerful sword non-stop. Combined with the style system, it meant that Jade Empire was crazy easy, and I beat every single boss in the game first time, without even coming close to dying. Another element that really throws the pacing of the combat off is that the resource management in this game is really weirdly implemented. So like I described earlier, the only way to heal is to use up your chi, and there isn't any healing or buffing magic as every single magical style is based around attacking. There also isn't anywhere to rest like inns or campsites, so once you're into a combat zone, it's you, your health and chi, and that's really it. It means that despite being able to have ludicrous amounts of health or focus, you will, if you stay fighting long enough, or are somehow not very good at the game, eventually run out. Now, games where you have a limited amount of health or mana and can't refresh it can be absolutely amazing if the developers have designed the game around this gameplay loop. Persona 5, for example, is all about diving into a dungeon and seeing how far you can get before you need to leave to refresh yourself. The whole game's designed around this mechanic and it works really well. Jade Empire is not designed around this mechanic. What BioWare have instead opted for is to just place focus and mana shrines at various points in the dungeons, which refresh whichever stat pool they relate to. It's never explained what they are or why they're there, but they're everywhere, and it's just such a clumsy admission that the combat zones just aren't really designed very well. It makes sense for there to be a shrine at the school in Two Rivers, for example, but why are there shrines deep underground in abandoned caves, or perfectly preserved in ancient castle ruins? The shrines also recharge while you're in the same zone, so there really isn't anything stopping you from just waiting around and eventually charging back up. Not that you'll ever need to, because I can't imagine anyone would have that much trouble with this game. There is a whole additional system that we've not spoken about yet, which I think was supposed to be the game's way of handling this. If you do a power attack with a support style, and then follow it up with a power attack from a martial style, enemies will drop little orbs on the ground which act as potions, with the colour corresponding to what it refills. Now, there's no way to know, but I'm so confident that this was supposed to be the way that you maintained yourself while exploring, not the shrines. You'd be in a protracted battle and be switching between styles on the fly to control what orbs dropped. Fall low on health, stay on the attack and get some back. Fall low on focus, switch those styles up and heal up. Thing is, we've just discussed how the balancing of the game means there isn't really any reason to ever switch styles or maintain a pool of 4 or 5 different styles. It means that the whole harmonic combo system is virtually never used. You'll take more damage and use up more resources just trying to get them off, rather than sticking to your one powerful style and mowing through everyone. I feel like BioWare realised this in playtesting, that the system that they designed just didn't work for repeated combat encounters, and then at the last minute, just stuck these shrines everywhere to keep the player momentum going. All in all, the combat ends up being an annoying combination of poor movement, repetitive encounters, and far too low difficulty, which gives the whole game an unavoidable sheen of tedium. Jade Empire lacks the depth to compete with the strategy of most RPGs, and has none of the fluidity that might appeal to fans of action games. It ends up squarely in the middle, satisfying nobody. So by this point, it's not hard to draw some conclusions for yourself. Essentially, the parts of Jade Empire that were similar to things BioWare had done before were pretty good, while the new, more experimental parts mostly fall flat. An area of both Baldur's Gate and Knights of the Old Republic that got a lot of praise was their cast of characters to explore and battle alongside. They are so much more than just another body for combat, or someone that joins your party and then stays silent for the rest of the main story, never contributing once their allotted introduction quest is finished. Baldur's Gate had a really interesting system where, depending on who you had in your party, members could fall out and even attack each other if they had conflicting affinities or allegiances. Knights of the Old Republic reduced the amount of cast members, but allowed you to engage in lengthy conversations and build rapport with them, eventually uncovering hidden backstories and quests. Jade Empire is absolutely no slouch in this department, with an incredibly underrated cast of characters. Seriously, check out any list of best BioWare companions, and I'm sure you won't see a single Jade Empire character on there, despite them being an absolutely awesome gang. Take Black Whirlwind, for example, who at first just seems like a mindless barbarian, but it's actually based on the character Li Kui from the classic Chinese novel Water Margin. A rebellious warrior with a habit of getting drunk and spouting sedition against the government, too chaotic and powerful to ever be held by any jail or sheriff. At first, he seems like he's simply going to be comic relief, but through cracking some jokes and cracking some heads together, you can uncover a really dark backstory and a character quest that involves fighting in the Imperial arena to avenge his enslaved brother. In fact, it's actually a lot of the less serious characters which I find to be most memorable. During your adventures around the sickly forest in Chapter 2, you meet a bun cook who's been kidnapped by a group of cannibals, and who, after being rescued, decides he'd actually rather not go home and wants to travel with you instead. This is Henpecked Ho, previously a champion arena fighter, but now married to a highly nagging wife who's forced him to become a bun chef and give up his wild ways of drinking and fighting. He's tired of being bossed around and decides enough is enough, the life of adventure is calling him again. Only, not to the degree where he would actually do any fighting himself, because if his wife ever found out, she would absolutely kill him. Instead, you have him accompany you in combat, and he'll throw alcohol out onto the battlefield, which you can collect, which enables the hyper-powerful Drunken Master style, an amazing homage to the Jackie Chan film that sees your character stumbling and falling around the battlefield, while accidentally hitting enemies for huge damage. It's an absolutely awesome combo of hilarious henpecked narrative and actual unique gameplay that's genuinely really fun to play. Ho himself is a fantastic side character, always commenting about how keen he is to stay away from his wife, but always paranoid that she's going to somehow find out about what he's been up to and why he's still not back from the market. Another area where a follower brings unique gameplay to the table is Kang the Mad, an inventor who joins your party after you liberate him from pirate employment on the condition that he continues to make his crazy inventions to the benefit of your party. Unlike Ho or Black Whirlwind, Kang's a non-combat follower, a first for a BioWare game, and instead is the focal point of the flying and crafting side games, which, unfortunately, as we've been over already, aren't very good. It's a shame as Kang himself is great, with his big googly goggles and obsession with blowing things up. He's more like something from Jak and Daxter than a serious RPG, which, to be honest, I didn't mind at all. After all, it's a world where monstrous toads roam the highways and spirits openly complain about their ex-wives. It's a bit of silly to break up the deadpan kung fu drama, and it's pretty welcome. Here we've got to take a detour to talk about how the followers actually function. Because despite all of the great designs and interesting backstories, there's a really weird decision taken that's clearly due to the limited resources of the original Xbox. Unlike in Baldur's Gate, where your entire party travels with you all of the time, or in Knights of the Old Republic, where you choose your favourites and the rest stay behind to guard the ship, Jade Empire restricts you to a single party member at a time. During combat, your follower either engages enemies directly, controlled by a very rudimentary AI, or goes into support mode and just provides either healing or buffs. It's actually surprisingly bare bones, and you'll hardly notice them contributing in battle. None of the support modes really make any kind of meaningful difference to your health or chi, and in combat, as you can't control who they're fighting or what moves they do, they're essentially irrelevant. It's just such a huge step back from Knights of the Old Republic, where you'd level your whole party and choose what moves to give them and issue commands in battle. It's not even like other games at the time weren't coming up with more interesting systems. Final Fantasy XII got around this by coming up with the Gambit system, which is a set of pre-programmed commands that the player can set for AI-controlled party members. It's something BioWare would steal completely for Dragon Age Origins, so it's clearly an area they felt was lacking, and it makes Jade Empire feel like a very solitary experience despite the broad cast. This extends to the non-combat zones as well, as you can only take one character at a time with you. If you do want to talk to anyone else, you need to go to pre-assigned places where everyone is standing around and you're actually allowed to have a chat. It's just weird. In Knights of the Old Republic, it made sense because you're landing on hostile planets and you need to leave people behind to guard the ship. In Jade Empire, it makes no sense whatsoever because there's absolutely no reason why the rest of the gang can't just follow you into the Imperial City or up to the Black Leopard School. It's literally just the game wearing its limited resources openly on its sleeve, and it's incredibly immersion breaking. It gets even worse in the moments where key followers have to appear. If you speak to an NPC who relates to a character who isn't travelling with you, the correct companion will just teleport in beside you out of the blue. Once the conversation's over, they're nowhere to be seen. It works in the way that hammering a nail into the wall with the heel of your shoe works. The damn thing goes into the wall, but there are just other more elegant ways to do it. What would be wrong with the NPC hinting that they know that character, and needing the player to just go and get them and bring them to them? The whole system means that you'll settle into this weird pattern of questing and exploring before returning to your designated follower camp and making sure to exhaust all of the dialogue options that are now open. The fact that it always takes place in the same location and always all at once is just a wonky system. These are conversations that should take place out in the world and, importantly, spaced out from one another. This is also where all of the romance happens, something which has always been a huge part of BioWare games, but not something I'm a fan of. I feel like I could write an entire essay just on how weird these romance systems actually are, but let's keep it brief. If you make sure that you always exhaust the dialogue options of the girl of your choice, eventually she'll admit that she loves you and you'll be able to either accept or rebuff her advances. I just find it so weird because it's such a poor gameplay interpretation of how romance actually works. The idea that simply paying someone a lot of attention automatically leads to them falling for you isn't exactly a mature take on relationships. I guess the rebuttal would be that it's not really a very well developed system because it's not a big focus of the game. But then why even put it in? In Jade Empire's contemporaries, romance actually served a purpose. In Fable, it's all a part of the role-playing, where you can buy a house and have kids. In Dragon Quest, it's actually got gameplay function. You can level up your family to fight alongside you. In Jade Empire, it's simply just ego fulfillment. All of the girls love you because you're the main character, and damned if you aren't amazing. I say girls because trying to pursue a same-sex relationship in this game is incredibly difficult for some reason. If you're playing a male character, Dawnstar and Silk Fox will come onto you incredibly hard. You need to have 0 other romances active to be able to get together with Sky, the only male love interest. If you do somehow manage to see that Sky romance through to its conclusion, the scene where they kiss right at the end of the game is actually cut short. It's not a great look from a Western developer in 2005, and it's not even like the demand isn't there. The most downloaded mod from Nexus is an adjustment to prevent the camera from fading to black. What's even weirder is this was neglected, but for some reason you're able to pursue a polyamorous relationship with both Dawnstar and Silk Fox. It makes zero sense outside of just appealing to teenage boy fantasies, as throughout the game, Dawnstar and Silk Fox are shown to pretty intensely dislike each other, only developing a friendship really late in the game. The idea that they're both so head over heels in love with the main character that they'll look past this and engage in a three-way relationship is just ludicrous. I don't mean to rag on the idea of including atypical relationships, but it's just not something that you can just shove in as a reward for romancing all of the girls at once. If you're going to put it in, you've got to deal with it properly, and BioWare just has no interest in doing that. Exhausting all the dialogue options at camp actually ends up being quite important to the backstories of the more serious companion characters, and you can end up missing quite a bit of important information if you don't make sure to speak to everyone each chapter. Dawnstar is the big one. She has a whole backstory that you unpick over the course of the entire game, eventually discovering that she's actually Master Li's daughter. A pretty huge revelation. What's frustrating is if you miss even one of these conversations, the whole subplot shuts off, and you're not able to pick it up again if you miss a step. It's so strange because it actually feeds into the finale of the game in quite an interesting way, but it's something that a lot of players might miss, especially given the weird gameplay loop of returning to camp after every single quest despite not needing to. If you manage to reveal the truth about her parentage, she'll actually appear in the final confrontation to try and redeem her father, appealing to any humanity he might have that he should turn back and leave with her. It's a pretty awesome reward for actually being invested in your party members and seeing their stories through until the end, even if it is slightly too easy to miss. It has shades of what BioWare would go on to do in the suicide mission at the end of Mass Effect 2, where decisions you make with your party genuinely affect the ending. It's a cool touch. Or at least, it would be a cool touch, if Li didn't immediately turn around, regardless of the choices that you've made, and say, "Guess what, chumps? I don't give a shit about my family," with the game just proceeding to go on to the 1v1 boss fight you'd have had anyway, revelation or not. For a game that broadly does a pretty stellar job of giving the player true agency, it's pretty ridiculous that the whole Dawnstar quest is essentially pointless. Master Li can't be redeemed no matter what you do, so all of those long campsite chats with Dawnstar, despite feeling like an important mystery to solve, don't actually end up contributing anything. It's a great idea that falls apart in the final moments by wanting to make sure that the character-driven role-playing never trumps hard and fast action. Sadly, it's a problem that the entire finale of Jade Empire struggles pretty massively with. We live in an era of hype and internet-driven anticipation, where developers and publishers race to get games finished in time to hit release windows that are painstakingly calculated to maximize profits. It's given us all sorts of wonderful new concepts like crunching before launch and the constant embarrassing delays from developers that simply can't meet the schedule set for them. The rushed final act might be the most famous one of these. The release date is bearing down and sacrifices need to be made in order to get the game into a state in which it can be released. The most famous during the original Xbox era was probably Halo 2, which had such a fractured development that Bungie had to cut the entire final section of the game and publish it with one of the most brutal cliffhangers in video game history. The other way of getting around not having enough time to fully finish the end of your game is to do what I'm going to call scope streamlining. Essentially, as you approach the end of the game, you reduce the amount of stuff the player can do, funneling them towards the end of the game, reducing gameplay options and upping the pace to make sure that you can get the player to the credits. Jade Empire suffers from this absolutely massively, and it's really obvious that the final few hours of the game were made in a serious rush. After being killed by Master Li during the twist in the Imperial Palace, your character's spirit wakes up in the afterlife, resurrected by the remaining power of the Water Dragon, but only partially. You see, you're going to have to travel through the world of undeath, guided by spirits you meet, to go on a quest to regain your body and return to the world of mortals and finally get revenge on Lee the Betrayer. It's a pretty awesome setup to the second half of the game. I mean, how many games can you think of that are designed to have you actually die and then legitimately explore and spend time in the afterlife? After the showdown in the Imperial Palace, it's a fantastic idea from a pacing perspective to shift things up and get a little bit weird before we barrel down on the final act. The only problem is, this whole section is pretty freaking terrible. There are early warning signs when the water dragon implores you to discover the Abbot Song, a spirit monk who died in the Siege of Dirge and who can help guide you on your journey back to the human world. It sounds like it'll be a major quest, like how journeying to the Imperial City was. And after all, each chapter has been roughly 3 to 5 hours so far, so it's reasonable to expect the spirit world to be similar. The problem is you literally bump into Abbot Song about 10 feet down the road from where you start. He's literally just sitting at a bridge seconds away from where you resurrected. You can basically see him from where you're standing. It's absolutely absurd that this is framed as a major quest, and it's emblematic of everything to come in the finale. I've also got to take a moment to point out how massively ugly the spirit world is. At first glance, it doesn't look so bad, with its weird clouds flashing overhead and its odd translucent blues, but that's genuinely all it is. Grey blocky textures with a blue hue. Literally everywhere. Every zone, every NPC, every combat encounter, every texture. Grey and blue and murky. Just remember how badly we wanted to spend more time in the heaven sections, with their weird off-kilter designs. This is the opposite of that, and while it might be thematic, because, you know, it's the plane of death, but it's an absolute slog to play through because it just looks so damn boring. And don't even get me started on the weird Joey Tribbiani Ichiban lipstick for men look that they've gone for with your character. It's quite literally impossible to take any scene you're in seriously when you look so utterly and profoundly ridiculous. So anyway, you fight through the Fortress of Dirge, which is now somehow in the spirit world, cleansing fountains in order to reopen a portal to the mortal realm. It's about 20 minutes of linear combat with zero strategic concerns or new enemies. There's no side quests to complete or branching paths to explore, just a straight run from fountain to fountain and then straight into the portal. Thanks, Abbot Song. See you around. By the way, we never see him again. And that's it. Chapter 5 over. And on to the next one. The whole thing barely even takes 30 minutes. So you emerge from the portal in Dirge, which is now also in the real world, and you've got your body back. And all of your followers have been magically transported to Dirge, along with their flyer and all of their tents. I get that it's an RPG and magical Deus Ex Machina, it's pretty much how a lot of these stories are supposed to work, but the fact that it's all magically resolved and brought together is really weird. There's no section where you play as Dawnstar, having to guide the team to Dirge, escaping from the Empire and heading to the Outer Rim. No quest to regain and reforge your body. It's all just pulled together after a loading screen because the developers are running out of time. The whole of Chapter 6 is essentially just a final roundup with your gang to finish off any dialogues that you might be pursuing, and then you have a final battle against the forces of Sun Li as they siege Dirge once again. It uses exactly the same map as the Spirit Realm, but thankfully it's now free from its hellish blue tones. The problem with the siege is that there's virtually no actual planning or strategy that goes into it. You just split your party up into groups and then take control of them in turn while they fend off waves of enemies on a locked screen. You might think this would be pretty cool, you know, controlling your characters is changing things up a little bit. But your companions don't really do anything. They have a fraction of the moveset that your main character does, so it feels pretty awful actually to switch over to Silk Fox and only be able to do rudimentary swipes and guarding. It doesn't bring anything new to the table, so you're just mashing through enemies, and then as fast as that section arrives, it's over. It's just another really rushed, half-baked idea that was obviously crammed in at the end. Chapter 6 ends with a boss fight against Death's Hand, the leader of the Lotus Assassins, and a character who's central to the plot of a few of your companions. I've not really spoken about him all that much throughout this because, really, he's just incredibly boring. You discover that he's the third brother of the Emperor and Master Li, who died but has had his spirit bound to a set of armour, making him immortal. There's a whole subplot where people think he's going to depose the Emperor, and you even spend a bit of time infiltrating the Lotus Assassin headquarters to find out what they're up to, but it just doesn't really go anywhere. They're making golems out of the spirits of dead people, but the golems don't ever do anything, and as soon as Master Li takes over the Empire, the Lotus Assassins just start serving him. So I guess they weren't planning on conducting a coup. Once you've beaten Death's Hand, you can choose to either bind him to yourself as a companion, which is pointless because he has no dialogue, and as we've already discussed, companions don't do anything in battle. Or you can do the nice thing and set him free, which I did. But that's it. That's all of Chapter 6. Complete in about 15 minutes, maybe even faster if you blast through the dialogue. It's a perfect example of that scope streamlining I spoke about earlier. It's the exact same environment as the Afterlife. There aren't any side quests or exploration, and everything is just barreling towards the finale. You press A and go to the next chapter, and it just teleports you immediately to the final zone. So finally back in the Imperial Palace, we fight through the same corridors that we saw when we originally came, while being guided by a cryptic water dragon who implores us to delve deep into the Imperial Palace and discover the true nature of the crimes of Sun Hai and Sun Li. Now, you might think that most RPGs end with their most complex dungeon, full of the most dangerous enemies with the most fiendish traps, but Jade Empire decides to go its own way here, ignoring those traditional ideas for its own take on the final location in the game. Instead, we get a handful of hallways full of some fairly weak enemies that we've been fighting for most of the game, and instead of a complex map full of puzzles and enemies, we just get the big reveal. We finally break into the nexus of the Imperial Palace and discover that the Water Dragon's spirit has been captured by Sun Hai and Sun Li, and they've been using this to save the Jade Empire from the long drought while also abusing her power to enrich themselves. Wait a second, didn't we already know this? We already discovered this in the throne room the first time we were here. And didn't Master Li literally repeat it again when he betrayed us? And then Abbot Song repeated it literally again in the afterlife? What the hell is going on with the writing here? It's like they went all in with the twist and then realized they didn't have any other plot left to pad out the rest of the story. So they just had every single NPC you meet recap the twist in exactly the same way. In what would go on to become true BioWare tradition, you're given a final choice to either free the Water Dragon or steal its power for yourself. Which I'm not 100% clear about, because I thought you had to take that power from Dirge, and that Master Li currently held it. But I think that might be thinking about it a little harder than the developers want us to at this point. After all, we got an ending to get to. Regardless of what you decide, you end up back in the same throne room again. I mean, Jesus, this is seriously reusing some environments. You approach the throne of the Jade Empire, and the final showdown with Sun Li begins. What follows is a boss fight that would probably be more interesting had I not become completely drained with the battle system by this point. Seriously, there is nowhere near the depth required for a 15-hour-long game, which really says something about how fun it is. Also, if you remember, I was completely and utterly overpowered, so I slapped Sun Li around while barely taking a hit and downed him in about 30 seconds flat. You engage in one last dialogue, which, to be fair to Jade Empire, is somewhat interesting. Essentially, Sun Li gives you the choice to either kill him or allow yourself to be killed, in which case he promises that he'll make you a legend in the new Jade Empire, a figure of history that will live on forever. It's kind of interesting, but the issue I have is that it's not really a moral decision. It's more a test of how much you trust Sun Li, which, if you've paid any attention at all, should be not very much. I admire the attempt to mix up the final boss and maybe bring back some of the grey morality, but the problem is that the whole finale of the game just totally undermines this, and essentially tells a story about pure evil versus pure good, regardless of how the earlier parts of the game played out. We've seen Sun Li slaughter thousands of people, harness the darkest of magics, and even completely turn a blind eye on his own daughter. There's just absolutely no reason to trust that he would ever stay true to his word. Regardless, you make your choice. I obviously went with killing him. And in return, you're treated to a short cutscene where a handful of people in the Imperial City cheer their returning hero. Except, and I don't mean to get too picky, but how did they even know anything had happened? Maybe only a day or two had passed, so I can't imagine much had actually changed for the people of the Empire. How did they even notice? And isn't the whole point of freeing the Water Dragon that their lives will actually be worse? I mean, another drought and they'll all die. It was all about restoring the natural balance of the world and fixing the afterlife, not making the citizens of the Imperial City any better off. Anyway, after that, it's the credits, and I kid you not, text screens for each character, which give you a brief paragraph about what they got up to after you saved the world. It looks terrible, and it feels bad. Games on the Super Nintendo literally did character send-offs better than this. Just look at Dragon Quest IV, an NES game developed by about a tenth of the people. You beat the final boss, and then post-credits you get a melancholy song playing as you drop your individual party members back to their homes. There isn't even any text, and it's more emotionally engaging than reading Dawnstar went home to plant flowers. There's no post-game, no New Game Plus, just right back out to the main menu a few minutes after throwing the final punch. That's a lot to take. It's a pretty hardcore anticlimactic ending after everything that was building towards such a fantastic twist at about the 80% mark. For me, this really wonky ending with its ugly textures and highly linear gameplay is actually pretty telling about why Jade Empire never actually caught on as a cult game. My theory is essentially that, along with all the reasons that average gamers didn't pick it up, that we've discussed throughout the video, and the fact that the game is a real mixed bag anyway, this is the final critical mistake, which means the way people view this game doesn't line up with the reviews. If only the most dedicated fans are getting to the end of the game, by delivering such a compromised final few chapters, you're essentially leaving the people most likely to recommend your game with a sour taste in their mouth. Just picture the scene. You've been excited for Jade Empire after reading about it in magazines. You get it on release and power through the whole thing over a weekend. Someone on Monday asks you, "Oh yeah, how was that game you're excited for?" And the first thing you remember is the endless linear hallways of Dirge Fortress or the god-awful Ichiban lipstick. You reply, it was alright, and then never speak of it again. For any game to have lasting critical appeal, you always need a group of dedicated super fans who are going to keep talking about it, keep making videos about it, be guests on podcasts to tell people how amazing it really is, how worth all those flaws it is. That enthusiasm is dampened by giving them the very worst part of the game right before they stop playing for good. That subsection of people who love Jade Empire, regardless of its flaws, just gets smaller and smaller the further through the game you get. The issue is that there aren't enough of these people to create a buzzing long-term community, which would create that demand for a Jade Empire 2. It's a victim of being good in the right places to get great reviews out the door, but poor in the right places to damage player enjoyment and kill that word of mouth which can make games immortal. It's the bottom line as to why Jade Empire never got a sequel. Despite all its ambitious design and interesting world, thrilling twist and great characters, as a game, it's simply just not that fun. So where does that leave us? Could Jade Empire ever make a comeback? Is it definitely too late for our world of spirits and martial arts masters to ever get a run out on the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X? Well, actually, earlier this year, BioWare released concept art for a potential Jade Empire 2 that they were at least partially working on. It's not surprising to see that they'd switched up the setting, moving away from the Chinese mythology to a more modern sci-fi cyberpunk setting, where characters would use guns and race across city rooftops. If it sounds quite different, that's because it really kind of was, and it was even eventually renamed Project Revolver to separate it from Jade Empire even further. Ultimately, it was cancelled as the project struggled for direction and never really solidified into a concrete idea for an actual game. As Jade Empire was really the long-term brainchild of BioWare's original founders, Ray Mazuka and Greg Zishuk, who have both now left the company, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see anything from the IP anytime soon. The last mention of any future Jade Empire games was all the way back in an interview in 2011, and even that was just a fleeting comment. But here's the thing, I actually genuinely believe that a true Jade Empire sequel, set in the Empire that we explored during the first game, could be a real success. For starters, the aesthetic is a lot more popular nowadays. The Nioh series and Sekiro have mined the depths of wuxia imagery to massive success. Both are absolutely oozing Eastern mythology, stuffed full of jade golems, massive serpents, and wide-rimmed farming hats. Warriors Orochi and Dynasty Warriors have both become long-running established franchises. We live in the era of the internet now, where tastes are extremely broad and minds are much more open than they used to be. There's no way a Jade Empire 2 would be passed over in a world where Genshin Impact is one of the biggest games on Steam. We've spent a hell of a long time going over all the great and not so great parts of the game, but when considering a potential sequel, there isn't anything so wrong with the core formula that couldn't be improved on in a hypothetical next game, smoothing out those rough edges into something that realises all the incredible potential. A lot of the main issues that I have with the original game are simply that it doesn't match the designer's ambitions, and that the hardware is clearly to blame for a lot of that. A new game developed on a modern console that allowed your party to fight alongside you against hordes of enemies or in detailed interactive environments is really not outlandish to imagine. I mean, BioWare have developed games like this since Jade Empire, with tons of enemies swarming the battlefields of Dragon Age Inquisition or Mass Effect Andromeda. What would really help a potential sequel is simply being bigger in almost every way, with much more of the Empire to explore and less restrictions on where we can go and what we can do. BioWare pretty much exclusively makes absolutely monstrous video game worlds now, and have an absolute ton of experience making them on console, so there's no reason to believe that we get another linear, boxed-in set of hallways. The idea of exploring wide open plains on horseback, or soaring freely through the skies in a flyer, is enough to entice anyone in. Finally, one of the main reasons I think BioWare should head back to this IP is that since the release of Dragon Age Inquisition, they've really had quite a bit of a rough time and could really use something fresh to reboot interest in their project. It's fair to say that BioWare really need a hit, and I think they could get one without having to go back to the same old franchises yet again, which would avoid the risk of franchise fatigue which can sometimes hit huge series. Despite Anthem's flaws, it had a huge amount of hype around it. People were willing to follow BioWare to a new IP because of their pedigree in making interesting and engaging worlds. Jade Empire could hit that nerve while already having an established lore to call upon. It wouldn't have to be designed from the ground up, but it would feel fresh because it's been so long since the last one, and so few people are actually familiar with it. We're living in a time where nostalgia sells. People absolutely adore remakes and remasters, with YouTubers and streamers working tirelessly to mine the depths of people's childhood memories for content. Anything that throws back to something people are even vaguely familiar with is guaranteed a little bit of attention. A huge developer resurrecting a franchise to finally do it justice, 15 years after its release, would be a huge headline grabber. You can already see the E3 or State of Play as Jade Empire 2 appears on the screen amidst thundering Chinese drums. It literally doesn't matter that a lot of people haven't played the original. Name recognition alone would generate interest and fuel the next hype machine, which I think modern BioWare would actually have a good shot at meeting. It's all completely hypothetical, but despite it sounding crazy, I think it could work. But here's the real kicker. While Jade Empire never got its own sequel, in a way, it sort of did with the next few projects that BioWare worked on. BioWare would follow Jade Empire up with the creation of two absolutely monstrously successful original series, Mass Effect and Dragon Age. While neither of them have even the slightest in common with Jade Empire when it comes to setting or world, both games were really informed by the experience that BioWare gained by making their Eastern action RPG. Those fantastic sections of the game we discussed earlier, they're very much present in both of those series. Extremely engaging and detailed world building, quest structure that doesn't always have binary good or bad outcomes, and a second go at blending the world of action games and role-playing, which frankly I think they completely realised in Mass Effect 2 and Dragon Age 2. While we might never have got to walk the streets of Jade Empire again, that wasted potential wasn't completely lost, and eventually was realised in games that came after it. Jade Empire was an important lesson for BioWare. How to design an interesting new world, how to make combat work in real time, and most importantly how to develop a totally new role-playing experience that worked for console gamers. We may never get a Jade Empire 2, but it was instrumental in giving us some of the greatest games of the HD era, and I think on balance, that's a fair trade. So anyway, that's Jade Empire. The good, the bad, and the weird. It's an interesting game that never got a sequel, and I think I've done a pretty comprehensive job of assessing exactly why that was. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a little something about a game that maybe you didn't know much about. If it inspired you to play it, I hope you enjoy it, as there's a lot in there we didn't cover. And if not, well, I'm amazed you made it to this point in the video. I'm Matt on I Finished a Video Game, and that was NoSequel number 1. See you on the next one.